Hello and welcome wherever you're joining me. Today we're doing Bava Metzia Daf 95 Amud B. So let's dive straight in. I just finished from the last sentence of the previous Amud. Rather, with regard to the Tana of the Mishnah, the matter that is explicitly written in the Torah he teaches. In many cases, the Gemara appears to state that the opposite is true. Sometimes the Tana states a halacha that is derived through interpretation before he states one that is stated explicitly in the Torah. The Gemara explains the reason for this. Since it is derived through interpretation, it is stated in Bava Metzia 108b. The Maharatz Hayut explained that principle that the Tana teaches halacha that derived through interpretation applies only in cases in both the halacha derived through interpretation and the one explicitly stated both listed in the Mishnah or Braita. In those cases, the Tana often cites first the halacha derived through interpretation. By contrast, when only some of the halachot are being cited, as in the case in the Gemara here, preference is certainly given to the halacha that explicitly stated in the Torah. And the matters that are derived through interpretation he does not teach. What does that mean? The description of the rulings taught by the Tana is difficult, as the Tana mentioned the halacha that the exemption applies not only when the borrower also borrowed the owner's services, but when he hired him. Despite the fact that this is not explicitly stated in the Torah, some suggest that the Gemara's explanation serves only to justify why the Tana chose to mention the application of the exemption only with regard to a borrower. He did so because the exemption is explicitly stated with regard to a borrower. Once the Tana chose to discuss the case of a borrower, he continued to cite additional halacha that applied to the borrower, even though that derived through interpretation. Alternatively, it is possible to claim that the halacha that the exemption also applies when the owner is hired is in fact explicitly stated in the Torah. The verse states, if the owner is with him, he does not pay. If he is a renter, he comes with his rent. Verse 22:14. Some commentaries explain, unlike Rashi in his commentary on the Torah, that the latter half of the verse can be understood as expanding on the phrase "with him" in the first part of the phrase. Accordingly, the verse explicitly states that when the owner is hired by the borrower, the exemption also applies. That's in the Rabbeinu Yonatan. Consequently, no proof can be brought from the Mishnah. The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Braita. If one borrowed an animal and borrowed the services of its owner with it, or rented it, or hired its owner with it, or borrowed it and hired its owner with it, or rented it and borrowed the services of its owner with it. In all these cases, although the owner performed the work for him in another place, i.e. not near the animal, and it dies, the borrower or the renter is exempt. The Gemara notes, the scholars in the study hall assume that this Braita is in accordance with whose opinion? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that one who rents an item is responsible for it like a paid bailey. According to his understanding, the Braita teaches that the exemption from liability applies to both a borrower and a paid bailey. Consequently, the Braita can serve as a proof. Doesn't this Tana teach even a matter that is right through interpretation, i.e. the fact that exemption from liability applies to a paid bailey, while he still does not teach that it applies to an unpaid bailey? It would appear that this is a proof that exemption from liability is not applied to an unpaid bailey, since it does not apply to the mishap that is the result of the bailey's negligence. The more refutes this proof, as one could count in accordance with whose opinion is Braita, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that the liability of one who rents an item is like that of an unpaid bailey, and according to his understanding, the Braita teaches that the exemption from liability applies to an unpaid bailey, and it is understood that the same is true for a paid bailey. Understood like this, the Braita explicitly applies the exemption from liability to a case of negligence. Since ultimately it is unclear according to whose opinion the Braita is taught, no proof can be derived from it. If you always say that the Braita can be understood as referring to an unpaid bailey, even if it is assumed to be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as Rabbi Avu reversed, Tosfos asks, why does the Gemara cite this version when it does not appear to make any difference to the discussion at hand? The Ramban and others explain that it is unnecessary, but that the Gemara nevertheless wished to note that some of the sages reversed the opinions. The Ritva explains that it is always preferable to establish a Braita as being in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, because uninterpreted Braitas are generally assumed to be in accordance with his opinion. There is a certain weakness to the refutation if it is posited as being in accordance with Rabbi Meir. There's opinions and taught. How does one who rents an item pay in the case of a mishap? Rabbi Meir says like a paid bailey, Rabbi Yehuda says like an unpaid bailey. Rav Hanuna says that the exemption from liability when one borrows an item together with the service of its owner exists only in very specific circumstances. A borrower is always liable unless the item entrusted to him is a cow and its owner plows with it in the service of the borrower, or it is a donkey and its owner drives it by walking behind it in the service of the borrower, i.e., the owner and his animal engage in the same work. And even so, the borrower will not be exempt unless the owner is working for him from the time of the borrowing of the animal until the time when it is injured or dies. The Gemara notes, evidently, Rav Hamnuna holds that the phrase "its owner is with him," Exodus 22:14, teaches that the exemption from liability applies only when the owner is working for the borrower for the entire matter. Rav raises an objection when Baita cited previously. If one borrowed an animal and borrowed the services of its owner with it, or rented it or hired its owner with it, or rented it and borrowed the services of the owner with it, or borrowed it and hired its owner with it, in all these cases, although the owner performed the work for him in another place, i.e. not near the animal, and it died, the borrower or the renter is exempt. Rav explains how the Baita poses a challenge. What is not referring to a case where the owner was engaged with different work than his animal. The Baita proves that the exemption from liability applies even in such a case. The Gemara rejects this. No, the Baita is referring to a case where the owner was engaged with the same work as the animal. The Gemara asks, but if so, what does the Baita mean by saying he performed the work in another place? The Gemara explains, for example, it is a case where the owner loosens the hard soil with a hoe while walking ahead of the animal. He is engaged in the same work, but not in the same place. The Gemara raises a difficulty, but from the fact that the latter clause of the Baita is referring to a case where the owner was working alongside it, it may be inferred that the first clause, i.e. the passage of the Baita cited above, is referring to a case where the owner was engaged with different work. As the latter clause teaches, if he borrowed it and afterward borrowed the services of his owner, or rented it and afterward hired his owner with it, in both these cases, although the owner was plowing alongside it, and at that time it died, the borrower or renter is liable. In the resolution of this difficulty, sages say, both the first clause and the latter clause pertain to a case where the owner was engaged with the same work as the animal, and the difference in formulation of the two clauses is because the first clause teaches us a novelty, and the latter clause teaches us a novelty. The first clause teaches a novelty that although the owner was not actually working alongside the animal, but was merely engaged with the same work, since the owner was working for the borrower at the time of the borrowing, the borrower is exempt. The latter clause teaches us the novelty that although the owner was actually working alongside his animal, since the owner was not working for the borrower at the time of the borrower is liable. The Gemara is puzzled. What is this? Granted, if you say that the first clause is referring to a case where the owner is engaged in different work than his animal, and the clause is referring to a case where he is engaged in the same work as his animal, then this is the novelty of mentioning what type of work he did. It teaches that it is irrelevant whether the owner did or did not work together with his animal. Rather, the liability of the borrower depends on whether or not the owner was working for the borrower when he trusted the borrower with his animal. But if you say that the first clause and the latter clause both pertain to a case where the owner engaged in the same work as his animal, what is the novelty of mentioning what type of work he did? Whereas this clause and that clause concern similar cases in which the owner is engaged in the same work as his animal. It is therefore apparent that the clauses concern different cases. The first clause teaches that the borrower is exempt even in a case where the owner was engaged in different work than his animal. The first part of Rav Hamnuna's ruling that the owner needs to be engaged in the same work as his animal is thereby refuted. And furthermore, even in the second part of Bava Metzia ruling that the exemption applies only when the owner was working for the borrower from the time of the borrowing of the animal until the time of the mishap, can be refuted as it is taught in a Braita. So what's the footnote there? Bava Metzia ruling contains two elements. First, the owner needs to be engaged in the same work as an animal for the borrower to be exempt. Second, the exemption from liability applies when the owner was working for the borrower at the time when he borrowed the animal until the time of the mishap. According to Rashi, the previous Braita refuted the first part of his ruling, whereas this Braita and subsequent one refute the second part of his ruling. According to Rashi's explanation, the introductory phrase "and furthermore" is used in an unusual way. Usually this phrase introduces an additional proof for the same matter, but according to Rashi, one must explain that this is referring to the fact that there is in fact another refutation of Bava Metzia opinion, albeit not the same element as refuted based on the Braita cited previously, Talmud Rabbeinu Peretz. From the implication of that which is stated, if its owner is with him, he does not pay. It's 22:14. Do I not already know what is stated in the next verse? That if the owner is not with him, he shall pay. Exodus 22:13. Well, what is the meaning when the verse states his owner is not with him? It serves to tell you, if he was with him, I working for him at the time of the borrowing. He does not need to be with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies for the exemption from liability to apply. So what's the footnote there? The early commentaries grapple with the underlying reason for these halachot. The Torah to me must suggest that since the owner commits himself to work for the borrower, the relationship between the borrower and the owner cannot be defined as one in which the borrower is entirely responsible to the owner, and the owner is himself responsible to the borrower. On the contrary, the halachot of borrowing do not apply in full. According to this explanation, it is apparent why the borrower's liability depends on the time of the borrowing and not on the time of the mishap, as that is when the extent of the borrower's liability is determined. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch explains that since, in such a case, the owner of the animal lends both himself and his animal to the borrower, it cannot be that his expectation is that the borrower would bear more responsibility for the animal than for himself. Since the halacha is that the borrower is not liable with any mishap to occur to the owner of the animal, he is exempt in this case for any mishap that occurs to the animal as well. If one borrows an animal and hires or borrows the services of the animal's owner, either at the same time or before the animal is borrowed, then the borrower is exempt in the case of any mishap. It is entirely irrelevant whether or not the owner was still working for him at the time of the mishap. And that's in the Rambam Sefer Mishpatim, Hilchot Shekirot 1.3, Shulchan Aruch Mishpat 46.2. But if he was with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies, he does not need to have been with him at the time of the borrowing for the exemption from liability to apply. And it is taught in another brisa, from the implication of that which is stated, if his owner is not with him, he shall pay. Do I not already know what is stated in the preceding verse, that if his owner is with him, he does not pay? Rather, what is the meaning when the verse states, if his owner is with him? It serves to tell you, once the animal has left the domain of the lender, i.e. his owner, and has been entrusted to the borrower, with its owner working for the borrower at that time, even for only one moment, and then it dies, the borrower is exempt. The Gemara concludes with refutation of the opinion of Hanina provided by these brights is indeed a conclusive refutation. The Gemara explains how the first of these brights arrived at its conclusion. Abaye holds, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shia, that when the Torah mentions two details together in reference to the halacha, it's presumed that the halacha applies only when both details are in effect. See 94b, and he likewise explains that the two verses are in accordance with Rabbi Shia, upholds in accordance to the opinion of Rabbi Yonatan, that it's presumed that the halacha applies only when only one of the details is in effect, and he explains the verses in accordance to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara clarifies, when the Torah refers to an owner working for the borrower, it should be understood as referring to the time of the borrowing and the time of the mishap. According to Rabbi Shia's opinion, this indicates that the owner worked for him at both times, whereas according to Rabbi Yonatan's opinion, this implies that he worked for him at either time. Based on this, Rabbi and Rava explain the verses. Rabbi holds in according to the opinion of Rabbi Shia, and he likewise explains the two verses in according to the opinion of Rabbi Shia, thereby arriving at the conclusion of the brisa. From the verse, if its owner is not with him, he shall pay. It appears that the reason the borrower is liable is that the owner is not working for him at either point in time. By inference, if we work for him at one of those times, but not at the other one, the borrower is exempt. The Gemara raises an objection, but isn't it written, and if its owner is with him, he does not pay? From the verse, it appears that the reason the borrower is exempt is that the owner was working for him at both points in time. By inference, if he was working for him at one of those times, but not at the other one, the borrower is liable. The two verses appear to contradict each other. To reconcile the verses, one must say that the phrase "if its owner is with him" serves to tell you if he was with him, i.e. working for him at the time of borrowing, he does not need to be with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies for the exemption from liability to apply. But if he was with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies, he does have to be with him at the time of borrowing for the exemption to apply. That's the end of the Omid. Thank you for listening. Wish you a very good day and all the best. Bye.